Co-founders are probably the most important decision you could make in building a startup. It's often about finding this very foundational ingredient and finding the right person to join you in this effort, right? Building a startup is like climbing a mountain or a hill, right? At least, and you need a good partner along the way, somebody you can depend on, somebody you can rely on, and if you don't pick the right person, it's going to be a very, very hard. In terms of size, I often say one is very hard to do because you're alone in this effort, and all the burden of doing the startup falls on you. Three and more tends to sometimes become large, unwieldy. You start to end up with a little bit of sub-politics, possibly sometimes. You end up with every decision becoming a big consensus vote. Everybody's agreeing to the lowest common denominator rather than actually making the right decision for the company and the startup. And so my best recommendation is that you go with two good, solid people. Two people who are well aligned in their interests, their own timelines, and who like and enjoy working with each other. Typically, I try to find somebody who's complementary in their skills, obviously. You don't necessarily want somebody who's a clone of yourself. I would avoid friends, even though that's the most convenient. Friends and family are oftentimes the most convenient co-founders to find. Why? They're right beside you all the time, right? And you're able to convince them, but then you're convinced them by your affection for them or their affection for you, not the strength of the argument or the idea itself. So that's very dangerous. And it often becomes hard to argue with your friends or your family, right? So I really try to tell people to avoid that. Age is no bar. Actually, I find young people only look for young founders, right? Co-founders. And old people hardly ever look for somebody who's 15 years younger than them as a co-founder. And that's actually, I think, a lost opportunity. I think, you should really look beyond the age barrier. Look for people who've done something before, who complement you, who can synergize when you bring together a team, and who bring skills that you don't have. Try to look for somebody who's actually better than you are at something, where there's something you do that you're going to do better than them, and they're going to do something better than you. And that way you actually have a stronger team. You should find people who are willing to disagree with you, but then once you make a decision, you agree to disagree, but you then converge on a decision, everybody should be kind of rowing in the same boat, right? And in the same direction. Otherwise, it becomes really hard, especially people who hold grudges and who, a year from now say, I told you so. That doesn't work in a startup because you're going to make so many mistakes. If your partner keeps telling you, I told you 6 months ago we should do the other thing, then you're going to go miserable back home every day, right? It's just not going to work. So, you don't want somebody who's looking back with, the benefit of 20/20 hindsight and saying, what I told you was better. That's not the right attitude to look for, right? So, in terms of experience, I try to find somebody who's done maybe startup experience before, who understands what it's like to be in a startup, because there's lots of bootstrapping involved, a lot of sacrifice in the early stages. And that's hard to find because even if somebody says they're interested in a startup, when they actually get into it, it's different, right? It's like somebody saying, I'd like to swim, but they get into the water and they're drowning. And then you're busy rescuing them rather than worrying about the startup, right? So that's not a good formula either for success, right? Look for somebody who's high energy. I say, have a very clear agreement up front. That's the other thing, which is basically make sure both founders, if it's more than two, make sure everybody understands what they're bringing to the table. Do not avoid this conversation. Lots of times I find startup teams avoid this conversation because it's uncomfortable. You're talking money and you're worried that the person might decide that you're not giving them enough and they leave, and then your startups, even before day one, has already collapsed, right? And so, but it's a conversation you must have because it will come up. And if the later it comes up, the more uncomfortable it becomes, and the more it destroys in value creation, right? And the value you've created. So have that conversation up front. Now, does it mean everything has to be decided up front? No. But you should have a framework by which you're going to decide. You might say, let us just work on this together for 6 months. And at 6 months point, we'll both decide if we want to jump in. If we both decide we want to jump in full time, here's how we're going to split the equity at that point, based on what we want to do, right? If one of us wants to bring a little bit of cash into it and we haven't been able to raise, here's how we'll kind of give consideration for the cash brought in, right? Or the effort brought in. if one founder has more experience or brings more credibility to the mix than the other founder, think through how you'll kind of equate for that, how you'll provide equity for that imbalance, right? So try and make sure there's at least one person on the team who can build what you're thinking you want to build, who can execute on the construction side of the thing, right? There's one mason in the company, and then there's one salesperson, right? You don't want to build something that nobody can sell, and you don't want to sell something that nobody can build. Either of those extremes hurts, and so you really need to find people who are passionate. I think people who are well aligned with your interests, who are well aligned with the timeline. You got to be realistic about the timeline. It takes time to build a startup and to get it to success. My last startup took 7 years to build before I could exit, right? And I needed co-founders who were willing to take that journey and who had the personal financial backing, or at least the alignment, mental alignment to take that journey, right? And that's very important, I think. In terms of vetting a founder that you don't know, because I've already told you shouldn't hire your friends and family, how do you vet this person? I think it's hard, because especially if you're the person who doesn't have the skills the other person has, you should have other industry people interview them, you should have other people meet them, people whose opinion you trust, meet them and assess them. You might even think of a probationary period, where you both go on a date for a long period of time, right? Without having to make any big decisions. Essentially the equivalent of an internship, right? And figure out how you want to work with each other going forward. The other thing I'd say is, sometimes I've found founders will actually decide who owns the veto right. I.e., they don't just split it 50-50 down the middle, because 50-50 means you could end up in lots of situations where if there's a no decision, right? Or where both parties are unsatisfied. Oftentimes I've seen founders where one says, okay, you're 60%, I'm 40%, and we'll make a lot of accommodation for each other. And in those circumstances, I've actually found the 60% founder deferring to the 40% founder more often than you think, and actually valuing their opinion in their decision. But what it does is it prevents kind of paralysis happening, analysis paralysis or decision paralysis happening, right? And that's very important again in a startup. You want to be making forward progress. You want to be, making progress without lots of internal disagreement. You want a good deal of alignment going forward. And so I'd say, look for synergy, look for passion, look for integrity, look for a compatible person, look for somebody with good experience, look for somebody you can trust and somebody you can have fun with when you build a startup. That's the key to, finding good co-founders, I think.